Hey everybody, welcome to Andrew Petty is Dying. This is the 101st episode, which is a fun thing to celebrate. And the first where we've done an in-person video interview, and am enjoying working with new tech and trying all this stuff out. My guest, Chris Marsh, today is the first guinea pig with this stuff. We had a few failed attempts earlier. We're hoping this one is going to be the good one. So here we go. Today on Andrew Petty is Dying, my guest is Chris Marsh, and Chris is a new good friend of mine, and he's also our pastor at North Route Community Church, about 30 minutes north of Steamboat here. And today he's going to share a story that he and his family experienced just over 6-7 months ago, involving his 11-year-old son, Brandon. And it was a pretty wild encounter with mortality. And we're going to dig into that and seek to understand better the impact that has had on him and his family, and the difference it's making as they move beyond that crisis. And I'm going to do my best to recount in sort of Cliff Notes form the story itself, so that then we can spend most of our time on the impact and any insights and awareness that Chris and his family have gained from the experience. Before I jump into that, a quick word about, in response to some comments I've gotten from viewers and listeners asking essentially, is this now a Christian podcast? Because they've heard me mentioning, perhaps more often than in the past, things that have an explicit Christian flavor to them. And, if the definition of a Christian podcast is one that's hosted by a Christian and Christian things are sometimes brought up, then I guess guilty is charged. But I hope you won't see it that way, because really the fact that some of those things are appearing more often than they have in the past is reflective of my own journey through life and the reordering of what matters more to me than in earlier days, and some pretty significant things that have happened in my life. My commitment to you is that I bring those things up as I think they have bearing on the conversation and that they might be of value to you, not in an attempt to persuade you to my way of seeing things or because I want to proselytize, but because my commitment to myself and to you and to others that I interact with is one that's been informed largely by Jordan Peterson, who encourages us to do our very best to speak the truth as we understand it. That doesn't mean that any of us speaks the whole truth, even if some of the capital T truth is represented in what we say. None of us knows perfectly or sees perfectly or speaks perfectly, but when we make a genuine effort to articulate the truth as we understand it in our current understanding, then the person or people with whom we're interacting have an accurate representation of who we are and what we think in that moment. And if they choose to, they can engage honestly with the person that they're confronted with, and the concepts and ideas and things that they're being confronted with through that person. And that's the recipe, as Jordan Peterson puts it, and I find it to be true, for the greatest adventure of our lives. Because as he says, when we make a genuine effort to speak the truth, by definition, wherever it takes us will be the best place to go. And so in my own life, I am attempting to embody that spirit and to embody that in word and deed, because I believe that's right on the mark. And it's respectful of you, the viewer and the listener, and it gives us an opportunity to stand on some solid footing and move forward together. So if some of you are turned off by the fact that more Christian stuff pops up from time to time, I certainly respect that. And if you choose to tune out, certainly respect that too. And if you choose to stick around, I'm glad you're still here and along for the journey. And I will continue to create episodes that I hope are of value to you. They are always interesting to me, and they do reflect my own process in life. And as it comes alongside your process in life, I hope that it does good things for you. So that's what's coming up on this episode of Andrew Petty is Dying. We will dig into Chris and his family's story, and I will first do my best to recount how it all went down. This is Andrew Petty is Dying, where we tap into the power of our mortality to become the people we were made to be and live the lives we were made to live. I'm your host, Andrew Petty, and I'm dying. I hate to say it, but so are you. November of 23, last November, the week of Thanksgiving, Chris, his wife Jamie, and their family, and I and my family got together for the first time as families. We were just beginning to get to know them. We had just begun attending the church that Chris is the pastor of. And we were getting together as families, get to know each other. And about midway through that evening, their 11-year-old son, Brandon, came down and said he had a bad headache. And, kids typically want to play, but it was bothering him enough that he was not playing any longer, was on the couch and holding the spot on his head where it hurt. And, there was some concern, but bad headaches come and go. And maybe it was a migraine, wasn't a common thing for him, but, migraines happen too. So the evening came and went. Fast forward from our vantage point to the day after Thanksgiving, and we get word that, and I don't remember how it came through the grapevine, but we got word that Chris, Jamie, and Brandon were speeding south from where they live in North Route, about 30 minutes north of here, into town with their son in some degree of distress. And we didn't know exactly what was going on, but what had actually transpired was from that Monday, between when we got that news, Brandon's headache had continued. It had kind of come and gone, but it had never really gone away. And then Chris's wife, Jamie, the day after Thanksgiving, had found Brandon in a very confused and fairly non-responsive state. And they got in the car right away, started driving south, called EMS. EMS was able to dispatch a sheriff's deputy to meet them before EMS could get there. When they met the sheriff's deputy at what Chris has told me was mile marker 11 on County Road. Is it County Road or State Highway 129?
County Road 129.
County Road 129. They opened the door and to the back of the car where Jamie, Chris's wife, and Brandon were. As soon as they did that, Brandon went into a full grand mal seizure and then stopped breathing. So right there on the side of the road, the sheriff's deputy begins chest compressions and thankfully is able to get Brandon's vitals going again. And so they begin speeding south again, make a transfer to an ambulance at some point, get to the Steamboat Hospital, and Brandon is admitted. And Karis and I decided to come over to the hospital because Chris and Jamie and family live up north. They know comparatively few people here in town than they do up north, and so we didn't know if anybody would be at the hospital when they were there. And we went over, and Chris and Jamie stepped out for a moment, and their faces were just the face of terror and grief at the prospect that one of the humans they love most on the face of the planet was potentially getting ready to leave them. And they didn't know what was going on, if there was a remedy for it, what was causing it. A collateral benefit of that very, very difficult moment was that it began to forge our friendship in a way that only crises can, as they continued down this journey with Brandon for many weeks to come. And Chris and I have forged a great friendship and enjoy his leadership as our pastor, and am thrilled to be able to share his story and his family's story with you today as a result of that. A much longer story shorter. Brandon made a full recovery, but what was going on was somehow a sinus infection had gotten set up deep in a sinus cavity and had begun to eat through his skull and access his brain cavity. And that's what had caused the seizure. That's what was causing the headaches. Thankfully, over a period of days, weeks, and months, they were able to irrigate and clean out the infection, a lot of antibiotics, various treatments to bring down swelling. And Brandon is a healthy, whole, happy, almost 12-year-old now, schoolmate of my son Marshall here at Steamboat Christian School and Steamboat Christian Academy. And so glad that was the outcome, and that we get to have this conversation today with that as the outcome. It was an encounter with mortality, not one that ended in Brandon's departure. Anything I've left out that is important for the viewer and listener to know?
I think you covered most of it. The whole ordeal from beginning to end was about 3 weeks long, from the time he started having headaches and not feeling well at all to the time he got out of Denver Children's Hospital was about a 3-week time period. He was in the hospital there for 2 weeks. Felt like a lot longer.
I bet it did.
Yeah.
Keep going. I'm just checking to make sure we're still recording since we're new to the technology. Okay, so 3.5, 4 weeks all in.
Yeah, all in.
In which you lived many lifetimes, I'm sure.
A lot of, yeah.
So I've got two boys, 12 and 14, and I can't imagine, and I also can sort of imagine trying to put myself in your shoes and going through that experience. And of course, I saw your faces when you came out of the ER, and it was just faces of complete terror, as one might imagine they would be. So what was it like?
I would say it was probably the scariest thing I've ever been through, and I know my wife would say the same. When he was on the side of the road and stopped breathing, and the sheriff's deputy was giving him chest compressions, we we were really afraid we were going to lose him. And I remember both Jamie and I, it was just kind of a reflex of emotion, crying out, God, please don't take him. Please don't take him. And, everything else was just kind of, we were operating on pure adrenaline. We got to the hospital. They ran all kinds of tests. And when you and Karis came by the hospital to see us, we had no answers yet. We had no idea what his status was going to be. He was on a ventilator. So there were just so many question marks. It was completely out of our control, and it was scary.
I bet.
Yeah.
What is it like even recounting what it felt like?
It's funny. This morning on my way here, I passed the spot on the highway whenever I come into Steamboat where he stopped breathing. And every time I pass that spot, I'm reminded of everything that happened. It's still very vivid 7 months later in my mind, and my heart beats a little bit faster, and there's a part of me that's still probably, you don't go through something like that without experiencing a little bit of distress and trauma. And then there's a part of me that's very grateful because, like you said, he's made a full recovery, and so we're grateful for that. But a lot of mixed emotions still.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
One of the points of this podcast, of course, is to help us all cultivate the mortality mindset, which is, simply put, voluntary integration of awareness of our mortality into our daily lives. What we do, what we don't do, how we make decisions, the priorities that we set, the values that we aspire to honor. And so that's why we're digging into stories like Chris's, is to explore how real encounters with mortality affect real people, so that those of us who haven't had those kinds of encounters can nonetheless capture the important lessons that they brought back from that edge of that precipice above that gaping chasm beyond which, we don't know exactly what happens, but we know there is an end, and we know there's an edge to that chasm. So that's why we're digging into the story. And so part of what we want to tease out together is how it's affected you, beyond merely, and that's not, emotions are not a small thing, but beyond merely the emotional experience, your perception of who you are now as compared to who you were before this. There was a pre-Chris and a post-crisis Chris. The first question I want to start off with in terms of teasing out its impact is, with the benefit of hindsight, what did you see in yourself in the midst of the crisis that you hadn't seen before or might not have expected?
It's a good question. Looking back on it, I remember when I first became aware, because I was down in the garage and Jamie was upstairs in our bedroom when she found Brandon, and he was in this not catatonic state, but he was not making any sense with his statements. He couldn't make eye contact with us. We initially thought maybe he was having a stroke, but I just was reacting quickly, and kind of giving direction. I was like, okay, I've got my son in my arms. I'm going down the stairs, and he's not a small kid. I mean, he weighs like 120 pounds. And so but it was like, I didn't even think about, that. And we just zipped down the stairs, and I told Jamie, call 911. I told the kids, go to our next door neighbor. Thankfully, he was outside, and we just acted, so that was kind of the initial response, and I was a little bit surprised by that, I guess.
Surprised by what specifically?
Well, just by, I don't know if you call it, fight or flight. It's similar to that, where you're just responding to the moment, and you're thinking like, okay, here's what has to happen. We need to do something for our son to get him in a place where he can get the help he needs, and thinking that it could be really serious, like he could be having a stroke, and knowing that we lived 40 minutes from the hospital, we needed to act quickly. And sometimes you try to project yourself into a situation like that. What would I do? How would I respond? And then it happens, and you find out.
Mm-hmm.
and so I was, Jamie and I were both panicked a little bit, but we knew we had to act. And so it's kind of your response as a parent. You'll do anything for your kid, in a moment like that. You just want them to be okay. So I don't know if I was surprised by that, but I found out some things that maybe I'd only been able to project myself into a situation prior to that.
And if I'm reading between the lines correctly, you found out that you spring into action
Yeah.
when a crisis emerges.
Yeah.
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 I mean, as a dude, I feel like that's a nice thing to find out. I mean, like, how am I going to, I guess for any of us humans, I don't know, because I am a dude and I can only speak from a dude's perspective. I feel like it would be good to know that about myself, that when it really hits the fan, oh, you know what? The shit hits the fan, Chris. I'm going to go ahead and say it just because you're a pastor, just to be scandalous right here in the moment. When it really hits the fan, that you spring into action. That'd be good to know. It's kind of like, your first time into combat,
right?
You don't know how you're going to respond.
Right. Will you roll over in the fetal position, or will you
play dead? Yeah.
Rise to the occasion?
Exactly.
Yeah, it does. I mean, in a weird sort of way, it affirms a little bit of your, I don't know. Okay. As guys, sometimes we wonder, do I have what it takes?
Yes.
That's the respond question. In the
do
moment.
I have what it takes?
And I suppose there's a little bit. I hadn't really thought about that, but now that we're talking about that, I suppose I'm glad I didn't fail in the moment, I guess. Although I was definitely afraid. I was scared to death. Mm-hmm. Everything was out of control, and so in some ways, yeah, you discover some good things, and then other ways you're thinking, man, I've never been more scared in my life. So it's interesting how you live with those two tensions sometimes,
Yeah, both things can live side by side. You can be scared out of your mind and take action.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm realizing that me asking if it felt good to realize that you rose to the occasion probably is pretty self-revelatory. It means that I'm wondering if I will rise to the occasions when they present themselves. So that's interesting. So how would you, I don't know what this question will yield, but how would you compare pre-crisis and post-crisis, Chris?
Yeah. I think there's some obvious things that I guess are predictable. I've always loved my family, my wife and my children, each one of them. But when you almost lose one of them, you hold them a little bit closer. You really just appreciate who they are, and you just want to, make the most of the day that you have, because you never know when your last breath is going to be. And that's just kind of part of the reality of our mortality, And so, I mean, not that I didn't appreciate that before and try to make the most of each day, but I think I try a little bit more now after that.
Have you found that effect has remained consistent in strength, or has it waned? Or
I would say it was consistent closer to the event, and over time, I mean, it does wane. I'm not going to lie. But I do have some reminders of that, as hard as it is to pass that spot on the road, It's probably a good thing I have to pass it, because it brings those things back to the forefront of my mind, and it's a reminder. I can see why, in the Bible, a lot of times, especially in the Old Testament, when a significant event happened, God would command the people to stack stones, make some standing stones, in the spot where, they crossed the Jordan River and went into the Promised Land, the nation of Israel. I think he did that for a reason, so that they would see that and they remember what happened for lots of different reasons. And so maybe that, in a sense, mile marker 11, that little pull off where Brandon stopped breathing is in a sense kind of the standing stones at this stage in my life. I'm reminded of it every time I get in the car and drive south. So anyway, but yeah, that's one way. My son, he's always, not always, but he struggles a little bit with anxiety and worry. And it's been interesting to see how this brushed with death, and he remembers portions of it, but by the time from the time he stopped breathing, or went into the seizure, he doesn't remember anything until he woke up in the hospital. But he's asked a lot of questions about what took place, and they had to do all kinds of tests, and he had lots of wires coming in and out of him, and he was on a ventilator for 4 or almost 5 days. And whenever he's facing hard things now, things that would cause him to worry or be afraid, this is one of those things we can point to and say, hey man, you've been through harder stuff than this. Believe me, a lot harder stuff. And you made it through it. And it's actually been really helpful for him just to be able to overcome a little bit of that. And I've seen strides in his life, which is helpful. It's kind of an unexpected outcome of that.
And specifically, what do you notice changing? I'm making some assumptions, but I want to make sure I'm understanding what you mean. So, what do you see that's different?
I see a little bit of courage to face whatever it is that's causing him anxiety in front of him. I see a little bit more courage to step into it because he does realize, man, I've been through harder stuff than that. I think we all need things like that, where you look back and say, man, somehow I got through this really hard thing, and then the mountain in front of you doesn't seem quite as impossible to climb. And so I'm grateful for that. I think that's not just been for my son, but probably for me too. There's hard things that we go through, difficult things with work or family or just relationships, and when you look back at the different points in your life and you see some of the bigger challenges that were like, wow, that could have been a bone crusher right there. It was a bone crusher for a time. And by the grace of God, you make it through it, and that helps you move forward. So that's been a change in my life, but also in my son's life.
What difference do you perceive in Brandon's perception of himself as a human as a result of this experience? Because you mentioned he is able to summon a little bit more courage than he used to be able to in moments of worry or anxiety. Do you see any connection between his ability to do that and an evolution in his perception of himself, how he feels about himself?
Yeah. I think as a young man, as a boy, I think he needs that affirmation, like we were talking about earlier. You ask yourself, do I have what it takes to, be a man, and I think as a young man who's quickly approaching manhood, I think those are really good things for him to be able to recognize and have feelings of affirmation that he has some strength that maybe he doesn't realize in him. And so I think that's been a helpful discovery for him. At the same time, we've had some really significant conversations about mortality. He's had questions about what if I would have died? What then? And that's kind of the question of all questions for humanity. What happens when I die? And as you were introducing earlier, just the component of all of this is very real for us, not just because I'm a pastor, but because I'm a human being. And I think we all are confronted at some point in our life with those questions. And this just happens to be the way, my son has been confronted with it. And along with that, our whole family. And so oddly enough, our discussions for a while after that event around the house were not kind of your surface level, conversations. They had some real depth and substance to it about your soul, the inner person, what happens beyond this life. Is there anything that happens beyond this life? And we've taught our kids, what we believe the Bible teaches about that, what Jesus taught us about that. But you can only teach things so much. Some things have to be caught, not just taught. They have to be experienced for it to become real. And I've seen that happen more with my kids and honestly in my own life and my wife's life. And those are good things. So I'm thankful for that being one of the outcomes. And before I forget, one of the original question you asked me is the before Chris and then the after Chris of this. As a pastor, I'm regularly, walking alongside people through grief and through tragedy. And, I think when you experience something like this personally, it helps you to become a little bit more compassionate. And, you try not to project your own experiences onto other people, but it helps you listen a little bit better. And, one of the things that I'm very grateful about the way our friendship has materialized. But, when you and Karis came to the hospital that day, saw the look of terror and fear on my face, on Jamie's face, one of the things I was so thankful for was that you guys were just there. You weren't trying to explain everything. You just were there, walking through it with us and making yourselves available, and just the comfort that we felt from that. I mean, it was exactly what we needed in the moment. And so I actually think about that, in my own, efforts to try to shepherd people and help them through their difficulties. It was a real example to me. So
one of the gifts of this mortality mindset work in my own life, beyond my own healing, has been coming to see just how sacred those moments and those spaces in time are. My wife's maternal grandmother died on Friday morning, and mom and dad were there with her grandmother as she was approaching her death, and we're sending pictures from time to time. And shortly after her grandmother died, Cindy, my mother-in-law, sent a picture of her grandmother and of Karis's grandmother in the bed right after she died. I mean, her soul, whatever animates us, had departed, and she was exactly as she had been when she died. And I told her, wow, thank you, because I consider it such a sacred thing to see the transition of a human from this form of existence into the next one, that we who are left behind can't yet apprehend, or
right.
We can speculate. The Bible tells us some things about what it might be like, but even that leaves a lot of room for, we just don't know.
Right.
And to be via FaceTime and text in their presence as she was approaching her death, this work has just taught me it's a place to slow down and to really be, and to acknowledge that something really important is happening right now.
Right.
And to, I think, demonstrate humility in the midst of that. And I don't think that in prior days I would have had the same relationship with those moments had I not been in this mortality mindset mode.
Yeah.
Because I would have had more of the instinctive approach, and the approach I had early on in my life when I thought I was experiencing my own mortality was sheer panic and terror, and to get away from it as fast as I could and try to make it better. But I feel very differently about it now, and so those are moments that I perceive as moments to slow down, really be there, really observe what's happening. They are among some of the most important moments we'll ever experience on the face of the earth, is either with someone else in a moment of duress, or in your own duress, and hopefully with others who can surround you and be of support.
Sure.
I'm curious, as the initial energy and fumes and clarity dissipate from the experience, and you're aware that it takes a little bit more mindfulness, and mile marker 11 helps you, if you were interested in it, what could you and your family do to keep the fire burning of the awareness of mortality, and that Brandon's experience brought to your family, that up until that point, though you discussed it and you had head knowledge, it wasn't as real as it now? What could your family do, if you were interested in it, to kind of keep those flames fanned?
Yeah.
Because you've said it was valuable.
Right.
The depth of the conversations, all of that, you went to a place that was of greater value in some way than the place that your family naturally went before.
Right. Yeah. I don't think it's our default to press into mortality. I think, like you were saying earlier, we tend to, by default, run away from it. And I think that's the way our society is because there's a inherent fear of death because of maybe a lot of different reasons, but maybe it's the unknown of what happens next for all of us, because we can't speak from experience.
I died once.
Right,
yeah.
right.
Well, of course, there's people that talk about near-death experiences and everything. Keep going.
Right. Yeah. And I haven't had one of those, so I don't really know about that. But I again, being that it's kind of walking against the current of our internal makeup to press into mortality, and without it becoming, because my kids are, the oldest is 13, the youngest is 8, and so there's a threshold I think that all of us have, maybe all of us are wired a little bit differently for how much of that and how heavy how much we can handle of the heaviness of those types of topics in terms of conversation and just living in the reality. Sometimes you just need to, let's just not talk about that right now, and I think we experience that.
So in other words, you're suggesting as my pastor that in the morning when I get up, I shouldn't greet my kids with, "Hey, you're going to die. Good morning." I shouldn't do that. I'll take it under advisement. Under advisement.
Yeah, I mean, you can try it and see what happens. But I think with my kids, I mean, I could see after Brandon got out of the hospital and things started to settle, the dust settled a bit. They just needed to have some fun.
Yeah.
I needed to have some fun.
Oh, yeah.
We needed to rediscover a sense of kind of normal living and normal rhythms to our life, and that took some time. I think we've kind of recalibrated for that for months now, but it did take some time. And I think there's a lot of that we have to just kind of be aware of ourselves, and then be aware of those around us, and that, again, that threshold, and just be sensitive to how much we can handle in that. But in terms of your original question, how do you not lose sight of it altogether? Where you just keep in view the end of your days, and not just live for the moment, but you're living for eternity. And I know for me personally, I can't necessarily speak for anybody else, but for me personally, I think that's where, my faith in Jesus, my belief that God is real, that his word is his revelation of himself to us, that's, as I read that, it's inescapable that, there is life beyond this, beyond the tangible, beyond what we see in all of our senses that we experience on a daily basis. And it's inevitable that all of us will pass through death eventually. And so we have to, we can't just run from it. We can't just hide from it. And we have to deal with it honestly, and then honestly make some judgments on what we really believe. Do we believe, for example, do I believe that the Bible's true? Do I believe what the promises that God has made to those who trust in him? Personally, yes, I do. And therefore it shapes, how I think about that, and it shapes how my family and I have dealt with this whole crisis and how we've gotten through it. And it would shape how I would try to come alongside anyone else who went through something like that, to try and comfort them and encourage them and help them through it. And so I think for me and for my family, I think that just keeping those truths in front of us, that we are holding on to the promises that, hey, if today is my last day on earth, which it very well could be. I mean, we could be done with this podcast. I could leave here and I could die.
Or I might kill you.
Or you might, right. My wife might kill me. There's 100 million things that could happen that are unexpected, and I could leave this body and this earth, and I'm done here. But I do believe the promises that I've read in Scripture and have changed and transformed my life personally. And again, I don't want to get into all of that on the podcast.
You can get into whatever you want.
Well, I just think that it's something that, we all have to deal honestly with death. We can't run from it. And then we have to decide, what do I believe can speak to that issue with any degree of credibility and authority. Mm-hmm. And
where are there reliable answers to our deepest questions?
Right. And thus far in my life, I'm 47 years old. I have not in any way been able to look at what I read in Scripture and say, that's not worth believing. That doesn't hold water. It's not credible. The more I look into it, the more the opposite is true. The more I believe it. And
agreed.
Therefore, that's where my faith is, and the comfort that gave us in the midst of my son may not breathe again. Not one time was I afraid of where he would be. And I believed wholeheartedly that he would be safe in the arms of God. And so even though I was scared, that's not what I was scared of. I was more scared of not seeing him again, not being able to tell him I'd love him, that I love him in this life. But I knew beyond that one day I'd be with him again.
One of the things that stands out from what you said that is for mass consumption, how desperate a place to find yourself when in the midst of a crisis you realize there's nothing above and beyond you to appeal to for comfort's not even just the right word, but like for sense making, for understanding where this crisis fits in the larger story and what hope there might be outside of this crisis, however it resolves itself. And you and I both, as Christians, appeal to Scripture as our authority for understanding capital R reality, not in all of its jot and tittles. It doesn't tell us about, how a snake moves along the ground, those kinds of things, but it describes to us how God has designed and reality and how it functions and how he functions within it and our purpose within it, which then gives us something transcendent, someone transcendent to appeal to in moments of distress and of ultimate distress.
Sure.
Now that is a very impersonal way of looking at it, and it's more for mass consumption. We have a very specific and much more personal way of thinking about it as we relate to God and his son. But for mass consumption, it just highlights how important. 2 episodes ago, I talked about, in response to a listener question that became the topic of the episode, how do we remain free from fear and positive when the news is full of fear and negative? And the final point I had in it was really the most important of them, and it was we need to cultivate a relationship with the transcendent, something outside of us and objective that's not of our own creation and subject to our own whims and limitations needs to have authority over us.
Right.
And there's a variety of different ways you can go about construing that.
Sure.
But if our appeal is merely to our own capacities, then I don't know about you guys, but I have regularly encountered the limits of my own abilities and found them inadequate. Like it's not enough.
Sure. Oh, me too. And not only just our own abilities, but I think appealing to our own experiences. As impactful as this experience with Brandon has been on my life, I realized that that's not ultimately my greatest appeal, is that I've experienced the terror of being right there on the cusp of losing my son. Experiences are so subjective, and that's why I think that it's so important, like you said, for us to be able to appeal to something that is objective. Ultimately, that being God and his word. And I believe that is objective truth. I do believe that we live in a world where we are not just constantly, at the mercy of subjectivity, but we can say there are things
the fickle whims and mercy of subjectivity. Yeah.
Right. That's an absolute, if you want something that's terrifying, I think that's terrifying.
And miserable.
Yeah. If all I have to appeal to are my own experiences or my own subjective views, there's 8 billion of those in the world right now.
Yeah.
And
each of those 8 billion people's subjective perspectives is constantly shifting
based on, all kinds of different internal and external influences. And so
it's the very definition of shifting sand.
Right.
It's not solid footing.
Right.
That doesn't mean it's not useful. I mean, our subjective experience, of course, has some value,
right?
But it's not the value of solid footing. On this I can stand, and from this I can operate.
Right. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
You've touched on it a little bit, but I want to know more about how the experience has influenced your Christian faith and how you relate to God. The truth is, ...
Yeah. Well, again, I think that death is inevitable for all of us. And, for me personally, I think that this experience has caused me to, on the one hand, be grateful for a whole host of things that, I don't deserve in my family, my wife, just health,
Right.
my son getting through this and still being alive and healthy and not having severe brain damage, which, we could have had. And so there's a gratitude aspect to it. But, oddly enough, a lot of the things that we've touched on, our friendship, the depth to which my family, I think, have connected. We've connected together, not just on a surfacey level, but we really have grown, I think, a lot in the substance and the depth of our relationships. Isn't it interesting how those things tend to happen through suffering and pain? And I think there's a part of that I've known intellectually, that God, this may sound crazy to people who are listening to this, but I don't think God just allows suffering and tragedy and pain. I think he ordains it at times. Ordaining something and authoring something are two different things. I don't think that God is the author of evil. I don't think he's against us. I think he genuinely does love us. But love and ordaining suffering and, because it brings forth a greater good, those two things are not mutually exclusive. And I'm still sorting through those things in my own life. I'm grateful for this whole thing that happened with Brandon because of so many things so many good things that have come through it that I'm still discovering. And had my son died, that wouldn't have been the worst thing that could have happened. There are worse things that could happen in this life than losing somebody that you love, or dying, or going through a whole bunch of other painful trials in one's life. And I think that's something that, is really important for every human being to recognize, because, if we're constantly trying to just pursue prosperity and comfort and convenience and all the things that just an easy, comfortable life, which unfortunately I think sometimes, I think that's probably the norm. Sometimes it's even the norm in the church. But instead of doing that, we need to be willing to embrace the hard things and the suffering that we have to go through. And, the book of James, it says, count it all joy when you face trials of many kinds.
I used to hate that verse.
It's a tough one. It is, because it makes you think, what kind of, what is that?
Kind of masochistic.
Right. And I don't think that's what it's intended to be, but I do think there is actually some incredible benefit, things that you can only really grasp. That's the only path that you can really take hold of some of the good things that God has for us, is through a road of pain and suffering. And, honestly, that's the path that he had for Jesus, is that it was a path of incredible pain and suffering that has brought forth the greatest good that could possibly be brought forth, because he made a way for us as human beings who've rebelled against God to be able to have lasting hope, lasting joy, not just the temporary fix that the world offers, but things that last beyond this physical life, that gives you hope beyond the grave. So all those things, are things that I feel like God is deepening me in through an experience like what we've gone through with Brandon.
Yeah, my experience, I haven't yet had an experience like what you guys have, but my own encounters with suffering have begun to teach me the same thing, that if we're willing to see it and if I have ears to hear, suffering is a form of mercy and an expression of love, because it is an opportunity for us to pierce the veils that keep us from perceiving what is true and real and most important in those moments where we are pressed right up against the very bleeding edge of our ability to function, we have to deal with the questions that are deepest in the heart of humans, and we, in the Western affluent world, have many ways of, on a regular basis, avoiding. To me, it seems like it is a matter of what we believe about the nature of existence. I mean, what are we here for? Where did I come from? What are we here for? And what happens when I'm gone? And if what I'm here for is merely to attempt to cobble together a reasonably happy life, and have a family and experience fun adventures, then events like yours and your family's experienced is catastrophic, because it's in the way of what we conceived of as the end of the purpose of our existence.
Right.
And so we relate to that thing as a very unwelcome arrival and something to get past and beyond and back to normal as soon as we can. And if we're not able to do that, and our view of this life is that it's primarily for happiness and prosperity, right, and we get beyond that thing, but we are in some way maimed emotionally, physically, or otherwise moving forward, then we set up a recipe for resentment, for bitterness, for victimization, for many of the most harmful elements within our natures to begin
right,
to bear fruit. And
sure. Yeah, I think, personally, I just think, and I'm borrowing this from you're probably familiar with C.S. Lewis, but, I think our desire for joy and satisfaction just isn't strong enough. We're bought off way too easily, so we, take, for example, living here in a beautiful part of the country, mountains and streams and lakes and just so much natural beauty. And that's why people move, by and large, to a place like where we live now. And what happens, though, is that if that's kind of the be-all, end-all, and they realize, man, there's still something I'm missing here in my life. One of the reasons why there's such a high suicide rate in mountain towns in Colorado, and there is a high suicide rate, is I think people, come out here thinking they're going to find what they're looking for, and then they don't find it, and they think, well, what's going on? And again, I think that's one of the values spiritually of going through a hard, painful situation where you're dealing with the prospect of death, or like what we've been through, is that it kind of brings into focus that the true nature of what you're really longing for inside, and it transcends this life. I mean, I think inside each and every human being there's an insatiable desire for joy and satisfaction, and I'm convinced that can only be quenched in God. And when you realize you might lose something that's really, really precious to you in this life, like your son, it makes you look outside of yourself and outside of this world for hope, for, and it kind of brings all that into focus. And
well, in contrast to someone who is living with the idea that our happiness and prosperity and comfort are chief pursuits in this life, if instead our conviction is that this life is about reestablishing a connection with the Creator so that then our lives can honor Him, then we are able to see anything that He would permit or ordain in our lives, however challenging, as yet another thing He's using in our lives to press us into a deeper relationship with Him so we can know what He's really like. If He didn't do that, then it would be a failure of love on His part, because where we find our full satisfaction, you and I believe, is in a relationship with Him. And so for Him to allow us to find sufficient satisfaction in anything short of Him would be a failure of love on His part. And so it's part of why I construe suffering in this life as evidence of His mercy and love, is that He's unwilling to let us find satisfaction in endless comfort, because if we did find satisfaction there, it would stop short of him. And ultimately there is a reckoning.
Yeah.
What else do you want to share? What do you hope that a listener would take from this conversation, from your experience?
I mean, if a person has, listened this far into the podcast, then I'm assuming maybe something has piqued their interest. But I know that oftentimes, when I was a younger man, I had no interest in being a pastor. I didn't really, and a lot of it I think was just maybe some of the perceptions that I struggled with, about what it means to, honestly, be a Christian, be a follower of Jesus. And I think my whole adult life has been, in part, a pursuit of trying to live authentically in that identity and not just put on a front, the Sunday morning, front like I've got it all together. And man, I guess if anybody's listening to this, I guess I would want them to know that, the Christian life is not about putting on a mask, trying to be somebody that you're not. I'm convinced that following Jesus is the most authentic way I can live, that any of us can live, because in all of our brokenness and this whole experience that we've been unpacking with Brandon, I mean, it kind of brought to surface so many weaknesses in my life, and I mean, it just, for a time, left us, and we were just devastated and in shambles and crying all the time and struggling with hope. But there's our son, and is he gonna live? I mean, just so many tensions there, and I'm thankful that I'm thankful for my wife. I'm thankful for you and Karis. I'm thankful for the people that surrounded us throughout and has kind of gone through that journey with us, that I didn't feel like I had to put on the mask or have it all together. It's just, I could just be the broken vessel that I was and still am, and so I guess what I would love to be able to communicate to anybody who's listening is that, if you take anything away from this, is that, God kind of takes those broken, weak parts of who we are, and there's a lot of them in each of us, and somehow he's able to work through those things and create something beautiful that ultimately the story is very redeeming. Not just because Brandon lived, he could have died. And I know I've heard so many other stories that didn't turn out, have the same outcome like we've had with Brandon, but there's still such a beautiful redemptive story in it, because ultimately, because of the way God used the weakness of the people, used the tragedy, the suffering to really shine a light on the greater good that he was bringing out of the whole thing, and the hope that we have beyond this life in Christ. And I hope that that's, in some way, God can use that, for anybody who would listen to the story, it would point them to those types of things.
Thank you for that. And thank you for your time and for being willing to delve into what was a very painful experience. There was nothing about that experience in the moment that was at all pleasant, I would imagine. And, thankfully you still have Brandon with you, and how wonderful that is. But to go back and to re-inhabit those moments can be challenging. But I hope also for you, on some level, technically speaking, therapeutic, and I think the more we're able to become intimately acquainted with the reality of our story, the better able we are to align with capital R reality, and that's always a good thing. And when we do that, decide how I want to respond. Do I want to respond in courage and move forward anyway? Do I want to shrink back and cower and circle the wagons? Those are one of two options on opposite ends of the continuum, and we reside all the way, between those two, probably at many moments in any given day, week, or year. But thank you for going there with us, and to all of you listening, I hope you found something that was of benefit to you, and I trust you have, because in all of our stories, there is something of value for someone else, a fellow human. I trust that there has been something of value to you. And as we depart today, I want to remind you that you are going to die, but you are not dead yet. So get after it.